The desert night was still, the air heavy with silence, broken only by the soft crackle of a dying fire. Shadows stretched long against the earth, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled to the moon. In that quiet space, two figures sat opposite each other, one trembling with inexperience, the other calm, watchful, carrying the weight of traditions older than memory. She leaned forward, her voice barely more than a whisper, the question trembling from her lips. "Will it hurt? Will you be gentle?" The words hung in the air, fragile, uncertain, yet filled with an innocence that cut straight through the darkness. No one could have imagined how that night would end. For her, the journey had always been about discovery, about stepping into a world far different from her own. A world filled with stories, legends, and mysteries passed down through generations. She had heard whispers about the Apache, about their fierce independence, and the way they lived in harmony with the unforgiving land. To many, they were a people cloaked in danger and myth. But to her, curiosity burned stronger than fear. She wanted to understand, to see what others could not. That hunger for truth is what had brought her here, to this quiet circle of firelight. Far from the safety of everything she had known, the Apache warrior sat across from her, his eyes reflecting both the flames and the stars above. He did not rush to answer, nor did he betray his thoughts with expression. His silence was not emptiness. It was a kind of patience, a test in itself. He had seen outsiders before. Some came with arrogance, others with fear. Few came with open hearts. She was different, and he could sense it. But whether that difference would protect her or break her, only the night would decide. The desert seemed alive around them. The wind carried secrets, brushing against the sage and stirring the sand as if the land itself was listening. Every sound felt magnified, the pop of burning wood, the steady rhythm of her breath, the shifting of leather and beads whenever he moved. She tried to still her hands, though they trembled slightly as she clutched the edge of her shawl. It wasn't just the fear of the unknown that unsettled her, it was the realization that she was stepping into a story that would change her forever. Her question was not only about pain or gentleness. Beneath the words, she was asking something deeper. Will you honor me? Will you guide me? Will I survive what comes next? The warrior seemed to hear all of it, though unspoken, as if her heart was louder than her voice. His gaze held her there, making her feel seen, stripped of every mask she had ever worn. In that gaze was something ancient, something she couldn't quite name: strength, sorrow, and a promise of truths that would not be softened for her comfort. People often think of the desert as empty, but she knew now that it was anything but. The land was alive, demanding respect, filled with lessons carved into stone and sky. She realized that tonight wasn't just about her and him, it was about something larger. Something that tied human fragility to the vast, unyielding wilderness. In that realization, her fear deepened, because she understood that this was no ordinary encounter. She had stepped into the heart of a story that did not bend to her expectations. The fire shifted, throwing sparks upward, and for a brief moment she thought of home. She thought of the warnings, the voices that told her to stay away, to never wander this far, to never trust what she did not understand. Yet those voices had never quieted her spirit. She had always felt called to the unknown, even if it meant risking everything. Now, as the night pressed in closer, she wondered if she had mistaken courage for recklessness. The warrior finally spoke. His voice deep and steady, carrying the weight of countless untold stories. But he did not give her the answer she expected. His words were not reassurance, nor were they harsh. They were something else, something that hinted at a path she had not imagined. His response did not calm her trembling heart. Instead, it made it race faster, because she realized that whatever happened next would not be simple, not safe, and not what anyone could have predicted. There is a moment, just before everything changes, when time seems to hold its breath. That was the moment they were in now. Two souls sitting by the fire, their fates intertwined in ways neither of them could yet see. She leaned closer, unable to look away, waiting for him to reveal more. He looked at her, the faintest shadow of a smile at the corner of his lips, not of amusement, but of recognition, as though he knew something she did not. The desert grew colder. the stars sharper, the silence heavier. Somewhere far beyond the horizon, dawn was waiting. But between now and that light stretched a night filled with choices, risks, and revelations that would test them both. She had asked her question, and though the words had already left her mouth, she could not take them back. They had become part of the fire, part of the story, part of the night itself, and as he rose to his feet, standing tall against the glow of the flames, she felt her breath catch. Whatever his answer truly was, it would not come in words. It would come in what happened next. And in that instant, she knew this night would not end the way anyone had imagined. The warrior stood, his shadow stretching long across the sand, and she felt her heart beating louder than the crackle of the fire. The desert seemed to lean in, watching, listening. She could not yet move, not yet breathe easily, because she sensed that his silence was not just silence, it was a language, one she was only beginning to learn. The way he carried himself, the weight of his steps, the patience in his stillness, it all spoke of a life carved by discipline, tradition, and survival. She remembered how the journey had begun. Days earlier, when she had left behind the familiar path of her people, she had carried little more than a bundle of food, a blanket, and her restless spirit. Whispers in her village had warned her not to venture too close to the Apache lands. They said the people there were fierce, proud, untamed. They told stories of battles, of warriors who would rather vanish into the cliffs than bow to outsiders. But none of those warnings had stopped her. Something stronger than fear had pulled her forward. It was not defiance, it was hunger. A hunger for truth, for connection, for something more than the simple life laid out for her. The desert had tested her even before she found him. The sun had burned her skin, the dry air had cracked her lips, and the nights had chilled her to the bone. Yet she kept walking, following a trail of half-remembered stories she had overheard as a child. They spoke of wisdom hidden in the old ways, of courage born not from comfort but from struggle. She wanted to see that for herself. She wanted to learn what it meant to truly belong to the earth. When she finally stumbled upon him, it had not been in the way she expected. She had not found him waiting in some great camp, nor had she discovered a circle of warriors at rest. Instead, she had seen him alone, seated beneath the shade of a rock ledge, sharpening a blade of stone. He had looked up without surprise, as though he had already known she was coming. That moment had unsettled her more than anything else. How could he have known? What had told him she was near? She had no answer, only questions, and it was those questions that had bound her to his fire that night. Now, standing above her, he lifted his head slightly, as though listening to something beyond her hearing. His movements were unhurried, deliberate, every gesture carrying a sense of purpose. He took a step closer, and though her instinct was to shrink back, she did not. Something in his presence rooted her to the ground. Holding her steady even as her fear swelled, she thought of the words she had spoken earlier, words that now seemed heavier than when they had left her lips. "Will it hurt? Will you be gentle?" She had meant them in a moment of nervousness, but they carried deeper weight now. They echoed in her chest, reminding her of how fragile and unprepared she truly was. Yet beneath that fragility, there was also a spark of strength, the same spark that had carried her across the desert. The warrior finally spoke again, his voice low, steady, and shaped by the rhythms of his language. His words were not in her tongue, yet somehow she understood. Not each syllable, not each meaning, but the feeling of them, the current beneath the surface. It was as though his voice bypassed her ears and went straight to her bones. He was not answering her question. He was telling her something larger, something about the land, about the night, about the path she had stepped onto without knowing the cost. She wanted to ask him to explain, to slow down, to give her clarity. But part of her knew that he never would. His world was not built on easy answers. If she wanted understanding, she would have to earn it piece by piece, step by step, through courage and patience. That realization both terrified and thrilled her. The fire burned lower, its glow softening, and the stars seemed sharper, brighter. She found herself gazing upward, toward the endless sky, and wondered how many others before her had sat beneath it, asking the same questions, seeking the same truths. The warrior watched her, and though his face remained calm, she sensed that he was measuring her, not her words, not her appearance, but something deeper. Perhaps her resolve, perhaps her spirit. She began to remember stories she had been told as a child, stories of maidens who sought wisdom, who traveled far and met guides that tested them in ways they never expected. In those stories, the endings were rarely what anyone hoped for. Sometimes the maiden returned wiser. Sometimes she did not return at all. The thought chilled her, yet it also made her grip the edge of her shawl tighter, as though holding on to her courage with her hands. He finally turned and began walking away from the fire, not looking back to see if she followed. For a moment she hesitated. The night seemed darker beyond the reach of the flames, and the silence deeper. Every instinct told her that once she stepped into that darkness behind him, there would be no turning back. But another voice, quieter yet stronger, whispered that this was what she had been seeking all along. To turn away now would mean living forever with unanswered questions. She rose, legs unsteady, and stepped after him. The desert floor was cold beneath her feet, the air sharper with every breath. He moved like a shadow, blending into the night, but she kept her eyes on him, afraid to lose him in the vastness of the land as they walked. She felt the weight of unseen eyes upon her. The desert was not empty. She sensed it now more than ever. The land itself was watching, listening, waiting. Every stone, every gust of wind, every distant sound seemed to hold meaning she could not yet grasp. It was both overwhelming and humbling, and she realized how small she truly was in the face of it. He stopped at the edge of a dry riverbed and turned to face her. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes caught the faint starlight, gleaming like fire buried deep in stone. He raised his hand, gesturing toward the horizon, and spoke again in that steady voice. She caught fragments of meaning, something about trials, about blood, about paths that could not be undone. Her chest tightened. She wanted to ask what he meant, to demand clarity, but the weight of his presence silenced her. She felt that if she interrupted, if she rushed, she would miss something important. So she stood in silence, letting his words wash over her. Even if they slipped past her understanding, the night stretched on, carrying them deeper into mystery. With every step, her fear grew, but so did her determination. She knew now that the ending of this story would not be anything she or anyone had imagined. The desert was vast, the warrior was a puzzle, and her heart was caught between dread and wonder. What awaited her beyond this night was still hidden, cloaked in shadow. But as the stars blazed above and the fire behind them died to embers, she understood one truth. The journey had only just begun, and the question she had asked, "Will it hurt? Will you be gentle?" would haunt her until the answer revealed itself in ways she could not yet fathom. The dry riverbed stretched wide and empty, but she could sense it had once carried life. The sand beneath her feet was cool, and in the starlight she saw faint grooves carved into the earth, as though the land itself remembered the water that used to flow. The warrior stood at the edge, unmoving, his gaze fixed on the horizon. She wondered if he saw things she could not, memories written in stone, voices carried in the wind. She wanted to ask him what they were searching for, why he had brought her here, but something in his stillness held her questions back. He seemed to belong to the night in a way she never could. She had always thought of herself as brave, but standing beside him, she realized how fragile her courage was. Still, she had chosen this path, and whatever dangers it carried. She could not turn away now. The silence pressed in heavier than before, broken only by the distant cry of an owl. She felt as though the world was holding its breath. Her thoughts wandered back to the fire they had left behind. That circle of warmth had felt like a shield, a fragile barrier between her and the unknown. Now, without it, the desert seemed endless, filled with secrets waiting to swallow her whole. He turned suddenly, his eyes searching hers, and spoke a single word in his language. She did not know its meaning, but the sound of it sent a chill down her spine. It was not a word of comfort. It carried weight, like a warning. She repeated it softly under her breath, trying to capture its shape, but it felt strange on her tongue. He watched her closely, his expression unreadable, then nodded once, as if testing her willingness to follow even without understanding as they walked along the dry riverbed. She noticed the ground was littered with bones, small ones, bleached by the sun. Animal remains, perhaps, though some seemed too large. She shivered and tried not to look too closely. The desert was a place of survival, and survival always came at a cost. Her mind wandered to the stories she had heard growing up. People in her village spoke of the Apache as shadows, peering and disappearing without warning. Defending their land with cunning and courage, some claimed they were ruthless, untouchable. Others said they carried wisdom too deep for outsiders to ever understand. She realized now that both could be true. The man walking ahead of her was living proof of that mystery. He was not cruel, but neither was he safe. He was something else entirely, something she had no words for. The night deepened, and with it her exhaustion. Her legs ached, her throat was dry, yet she pushed forward, afraid to lose him in the darkness. At last, they reached a cluster of stones stacked in a formation that seemed too deliberate to be natural. He stopped there, running his hand across one of the stones, as if greeting an old friend. She watched, puzzled, until he motioned for her to kneel beside him. At first, she saw nothing unusual. But when she leaned closer, she noticed carvings etched faintly into the rock symbols worn down by time, yet still visible. Spirals, lines, figures that looked like animals or spirits. She reached out, but before her fingers touched the stone, he caught her wrist. His grip was firm but not harsh, his eyes holding hers with an intensity that froze her in place. Slowly he shook his head. Her heart pounded. She understood enough. These carvings were not for her hands, not yet. They belonged to his people, his ancestors. She felt ashamed for reaching without thought. But more than that, she felt the weight of what these symbols must mean. They were not just drawings, they were pieces of a story older than she could imagine. He released her wrist, and for a moment they sat in silence. She wished she could ask him what the carvings told, but words felt useless here. This was a language beyond her reach, a history she could only glimpse. The mystery of it burned inside her, deepening both her curiosity and her unease. As the wind picked up, she thought she heard whispers, faint, almost like voices carried from far away. She knew it must have been her imagination, the play of the wind against the rocks, but it unsettled her nonetheless. She glanced at the warrior, wondering if he heard it too. His face was calm, though his eyes seemed sharper, as if he were listening closely. They camped near the stones that night, with only the faint glow of embers to keep the darkness at bay. She lay awake, staring at the sky, unable to rest. Questions circled her mind. Why had he chosen to guide her? What did he expect of her? And what was hidden in the carvings, in the silence, in the spaces he never explained? At times she thought of home, of the safety she had abandoned. There was a part of her that longed to return, to leave behind the fear that gnawed at her. But another part, the stronger part, refused. She had stepped too far into this story to walk away. The desert had claimed her. She knew its grip would not let her go until she had seen it through, in the days that followed. He led her deeper into the land. They moved through canyons that swallowed the sun, across plains where the wind howled like a living thing, and up ridges where the world seemed to stretch endlessly. With each step, she felt the distance from her old life widening, until the memories of her village seemed like a dream, yet the deeper they went, the more she felt the conflict stirring not between her and him, but inside herself. A battle between fear and trust, between doubt and faith. She wanted to believe that he was guiding her toward something meaningful, something worth the danger. But another voice whispered that she was only a fool chasing shadows, that she was nothing but a stranger trespassing in a world not meant for her. One evening, as the sun bled across the horizon in shades of red and gold, they came upon the faint remnants of another camp, ashes scattered in the dirt, footprints half buried in sand. She felt a shiver of recognition. Others had been here before. Were they like her? Did they seek answers too? And if so, what had become of them? The warrior's expression darkened as he studied the ground. He said nothing, but she sensed the weight of his silence. That night, As the wind rose and the stars flickered above, she lay awake again, more restless than ever. The carvings, the whispers, the empty camp, they all tangled together in her mind, weaving a story she could not yet read. The warrior's patience, his silences, his steady gaze, all of it built a tension that pressed down on her chest, leaving her caught between awe and dread. The journey was no longer about curiosity alone. She could feel it now. There was something at stake, something larger than herself. What it was, she could not yet see. But every step drew her closer to it, and every choice carried the weight of an ending that no one could predict. The night after they found the abandoned camp was colder than any before. The embers they lit gave off only a faint glow, as though even fire hesitated to burn in that place. She lay awake, her body weary but her mind sharp with unease. The silence was not empty. It was heavy, almost pressing against her skin. Every shift of the wind, every faint rustle in the brush felt like something watching from just beyond the reach of the flames. She turned her eyes toward the warrior who sat motionless, staring into the darkness as if he saw shapes she could not. His stillness was both a comfort and a reminder of how little she understood him. When dawn finally came, the light revealed more than she expected. Near the ashes of the old camp, she noticed faint markings carved into the dirt, half buried by sand. They were not random. Circles, crossed lines, and symbols that echoed the carvings on the stone they had seen before. She crouched low, tracing the edge of one with her fingertip, her heart beating fast. These were signs, messages left behind by others. But what did they mean? Warnings? Prayers? Or something darker? The warrior stepped beside her, his shadow falling across the symbols. His jaw tightened as he looked at them, and though his expression gave little away, she felt his tension. He brushed the sand back over the markings with his hand, erasing them, as if they were not meant for her eyes. She wanted to protest, to demand he tell her what they said, but his silence weighed heavier than any words. She realized that some truths were guarded too closely to be shared easily as they continued deeper into the desert. The land grew harsher. The canyons narrowed, forcing them into paths where the cliffs loomed high above, blocking out the sky. She felt trapped, as though the earth itself was closing in. At times the air grew so still that her own breathing sounded too loud, echoing in her ears. She tried to steady herself, but the unease coiled tighter inside her with every step. The warrior moved with purpose, never faltering, but she could sense that he, too, was alert more than before. His eyes scanned the cliffs, his steps slowed at certain bends, and his hand hovered near the blade strapped to his side. She began to understand that whatever path they were on, it was not empty. Something lingered here, something he was preparing for, though he said nothing of it aloud. That night, they camped in a hollow between two cliffs. The firelight flickered against the stone walls, throwing shadows that seemed alive. She sat close to the flames, wrapping her shawl tight around her shoulders, but the warmth did not chase away her chill. The warrior spoke a few words into the night, his voice low, rhythmic, almost like a chant. She could not understand the language, but the sound of it raised goosebumps on her arms. It felt less like speech and more like calling out to something unseen. Her sleep was broken by a sound she could not place. A scrape, a shuffle, somewhere beyond the circle of firelight. She froze, her heart hammering, afraid to move. Slowly, she turned her head toward the warrior. He was awake, his hand already on his blade, eyes locked on the shadows. He lifted one finger to his lips, a silent command for her to stay still. The sound came again, closer this time. A whisper of stone shifting, a soft crunch of sand. She strained her ears, but the night was too thick, the darkness too deep. She wanted to believe it was only the wind, but she knew better. The warrior rose slowly, his movements silent, and stepped toward the edge of the fire's glow. His silhouette blended with the shadows, and for a terrifying moment, she could not see him at all. The silence stretched long and unbearable before he returned. He said nothing, only sat back by the fire, but his expression was darker now. She dared to ask what it was, her voice trembling. He met her eyes, then shook his head. No answer, no explanation. That, more than anything, filled her with dread. By morning, the canyon felt different. The air seemed heavier, the light dimmer, even under the sun. She followed him without question, her nerves stretched thin. Every sound behind her made her glance over her shoulder, half expecting to see eyes staring back. Nothing was there, yet the feeling never left. Hours later, they reached a place where the canyon walls opened into a wide basin. At its center stood another formation of stones, taller this time, stacked in a way that defied balance. Around their base, more carvings covered the ground circles within circles. Jagged lines, symbols that seemed to radiate outward like fire. She stopped, breath caught in her throat. The place felt alive, humming with something she could not see. The warrior approached the stones, kneeling before them. His head bowed, his lips moved in a whisper she could not hear. She stayed back, afraid to interrupt. The air around her felt thick, charged, as if she had stepped into the heart of a storm. Her chest tightened, her skin prickled, and though the sun still shone above, a shadow seemed to stretch across the basin. Then she heard it. Faint, distant, but real. A cry carried on the wind. Not an animal, not the coyote she had heard before. A human sound, anguish, pain, or perhaps warning. Her blood ran cold. She looked to the warrior, but he did not move, did not react. It was as though he expected it. She wanted to run to him, to demand answers. But her legs felt rooted to the ground. The cry came again, sharper this time, echoing against the canyon walls. She pressed her hands to her ears, but the sound cut straight through, lodging deep in her chest. Her heart raced, her breath grew shallow. She turned, desperate to see where it came from, but the basin was empty, nothing but sand and stone. The warrior rose then, slowly, and turned to face her. His expression was no longer calm. It was grim, almost sorrowful, as if he knew what was coming. He gestured for her to follow him closer to the stones. Her body resisted, every instinct screaming to stay back, but his eyes held hers, steady and unyielding. Something in that gaze told her she had no choice. Her steps were heavy, each one harder than the last, until she stood beside him at the base of the stones. The carvings beneath her feet seemed to pulse, or perhaps it was only her imagination. She wanted to ask what this place was, what it meant, but her voice refused to come. The wind rose suddenly, whipping her shawl around her, stinging her eyes with sand. She raised her hand to shield her face, and in that moment, she thought she saw movement among the rock shadows shifting, shapes forming where none had been before. She blinked, heart racing, and they were gone. The warrior's hand rested briefly on her shoulder, grounding her, steadying her. But when she looked at him, she saw the same tension in his eyes. Whatever they had come to find, whatever test this was leading to, it was near, closer than ever. The cries echoed once more, louder, closer, impossible to ignore. The ground beneath them seemed to tremble, the air thick with unseen weight. She felt trapped between terror and awe, unable to move, unable to breathe. The warrior lifted his blade, not in threat, but in readiness, his stance solid. His gaze locked on the horizon. She realized then that the moment they had been walking toward since the firelit night had arrived. The desert was no longer silent. The story had reached its edge, and just as the air split with another cry, louder than before, everything she thought she knew about this journey began to unravel. The climax was coming, and whatever awaited them in the shadows would change everything. The cry that split the air carried through the canyon, echoing like thunder. She froze, every part of her trembling, but the warrior did not waver. His blade caught the starlight, his stance steady, as if he had known this moment would come all along. For an instant she thought something would appear out of the shadows, some figure, some enemy, but nothing came. Only silence followed, heavy and endless. The ground stilled, the wind quieted. She was left with her own breath loud in her ears. The warrior lowered his weapon slowly. His eyes softened, though they still carried that weight she had come to know. The weight of a man who carried both his people and their secrets. He looked at her, and for the first time, she saw not only the warrior, but also the man beneath the role. There was weariness there, a kind of sorrow, mixed with strength. He nodded once, as though confirming something unspoken between them. She found her voice at last, though it shook when she spoke. She asked him what the cries meant, why the land itself seemed alive with echoes of pain. He listened, then knelt beside the stones again, pressing his hand against one of the carvings. His voice came low, steady, and though the words were not hers, she understood enough. This place held memories. The stones carried the stories of battles, of lives lost, of vows made and broken. The cries were not of flesh and blood. They were echoes, reminders of what had been. A chill spread through her, but it was not fear this time, it was understanding. She realized that what she had been seeking all along was not a single answer, not a clear path. It was this: the truth that some stories are too large to belong to one person, too vast to be contained in words. The warrior had brought her here not to solve a mystery, but to let her feel the weight of it for herself. They stood together in the basin, and she looked around at the carvings once more. They no longer seemed like riddles beyond her reach. They felt alive, breathing with the past, speaking a language of endurance. She thought of the journey that had carried her this far, the desert's trials, the silence of the nights, the firelit questions she had whispered into the dark. All of it had shaped her, had stripped away the illusions she once clung to. As the wind settled, the basin grew calm again. The cries faded into memory, leaving only the quiet hum of the desert. She turned to the warrior, her voice steadier now, and asked if this was the end. He studied her for a long moment, then shook his head. Not the end, he seemed to say, but a beginning. A path had been opened, one she must walk on her own. She felt both relief and sorrow. Relief that the terror had passed, sorrow that she would not have the comfort of staying under his guidance forever. The bond they had formed was real, though forged in silence more than words. She knew she could not hold on to him. He belonged to his people, to his land, to the weight of stories far older than her own. When they left the basin, the sun was rising, painting the desert gold. The light stretched across the sand, softening the shadows, making the world seem new. For the first time, she felt the desert not as a place of danger, but as a teacher. Every ridge, every stone, every gust of wind carried wisdom for those willing to listen. She had been afraid of it, but now she saw its beauty. The journey back was quieter. The warrior spoke little, but he no longer needed to. She had learned how to read his silence, how to feel the meaning beneath it. At night, when they sat by the fire, she no longer asked the same questions. Instead, she listened to the crackle of flames, to the distant calls of night creatures, to the steady rhythm of her own heart in her dreams. She sometimes heard the cries again, but they no longer filled her with dread. They felt like reminders of the truth she had touched, that pain and loss are part of the land, part of life, and that courage is found not in running from them but in facing them. She woke each morning with a sense of calm, stronger than before, at last. The day came when the warrior stopped at the edge of a ridge. Below them stretched the path back toward her village, faint but familiar. He turned to her, his eyes meeting hers, and though he said nothing, she understood. This was where their journey together ended. Her chest tightened with both gratitude and grief. She wanted to thank him, to tell him how deeply he had changed her, but she knew words would fall short. Instead, she bowed her head slightly, a gesture of respect, and hoped he understood. His gaze softened, and for the first time, she thought she saw the faintest trace of a smile. She walked down the ridge alone, each step carrying her closer to home. The land felt different now, though she knew it was the same. What had changed was her. She no longer felt like the restless girl who had left in search of answers. She carried within her a quiet strength, born from the silence of the desert, from the patience of the warrior, from the echo of ancient cries. When her village came into view, she felt a wave of emotions, relief, belonging, but also distance. She would return, but she would never be the same. The others might not understand, and that was all right. The journey was hers alone, and the lessons were etched into her spirit like the carvings in stone. That night, as she lay in her bed for the first time in weeks, She whispered the words she had spoken at the beginning, under the firelit sky. Will it hurt? Will you be gentle? They no longer carried fear. They carried meaning. She knew now that life would hurt, and sometimes it would not be gentle. But she also knew she had the strength to face it, to carry both pain and wonder. Just as the land carried its stories, the desert had not answered her questions in the way she expected. It had given her something more valuable, the understanding that courage is not the absence of fear, but the choice to keep walking even when the path is uncertain. The warrior's silence had been his answer all along, teaching her that the greatest truths are felt, not spoken, and so her story ended not with certainty, but with wisdom. She had ventured into the unknown, faced the shadows, and returned changed. The memory of the warrior, of the carvings, of the cries that echoed through the night would remain with her forever. The desert had given her its gift, and it would live in her heart as long as she walked this earth.